The time is 10:35 am. The precipitation tank inside the JCO fuel enrichment facility has gone critical. Neutrons, the most powerful form of radiation, had blasted out of the precipitation tank into the bodies of Hisashi Ouchi and Masato Shinohara. Gamma rays, rays of ionising radiation, were projected out of the building in all directions, covering the entire site and into the houses that sat just a couple hundred meters away. The Tokaimura Criticality Accident is at its height. The next few hours will be just as critical in halting the tragic chaos. As an alarm blared out into the conversion test building, where Ouchi and Shinohara had poured enough uranyl nitrate solution to cause a prompt criticality, the two men hurried out of the room under the orders of their superior, Yutaka Yokokawa. Yokokawa himself looked into the room and towards the tank. None of the blue glow he had seen that second of criticality remained. There was no boiling. There were no vibrations or steam rising from the tank. But Yokokawa knew that the precipitation tank had gone critical. Ouchi and Shinohara evacuated the conversion test building into the adjoining administration building, which served as a locker room for people entering the conversion test building. Yokokawa, meanwhile, managed to call his superiors and announce to them that a criticality accident had occurred. They didn't believe him, considering him too stupid to know what a criticality even was, but still made their way to the locker room just in case. Yokokawa, however, had taken the complete opposite view to his superiors, considering the criticality to be so severe that his life was already over. With that acknowledgement, and therefore no fear, he went back to the still silent precipitation tank to check one last time. He wondered if that flash was it, and if the criticality was already over. How short it was, he thought, and yet how much damage it had done. The criticality inside the tank was unusual. As the fission would occur, the water inside the tank, which served as moderator for the neutrons inside, would boil away. This caused the fission to halt, but the still active water jacket would cool down the solution again, condensing the water and causing the criticality to begin once more. He made his way back to the administration building, where Ouchi had collapsed into a seizure, choking on his own vomit that was stuck in his trachea, and Shinohara was trying to revive him. Someone else joined them in minutes. Hiroshi Watanabe, the fourth member of the special crew that had been absent during the final days of creating the nuclear fuel that caused the accident. A few other people had gathered by, watching but not assisting as Watanabe, Shinohara, and Yokokawa moved to save Ouchi's life. The method they used to unblock his windpipe was unorthodox, and involved taking a pair of chopsticks and inserting them into his mouth, forcing his throat open and allowing all of the vomit to spill out. It worked, and shortly thereafter Ouchi, still feeling extremely ill, regained consciousness. As he did, Watanabe left the room to call an ambulance. By 10:45 am, 50 JCO employees had gathered at the muster station, just 150 meters from the precipitation tank. The number kept climbing, and then a dosimetrist checked the radiation level and saw it was massively too high. By 10:56, a total of 121 workers were walking to the southeast corner of the site, almost 300 meters away from the tank, to an area where the radiation dosage was much lower. It was at this time that the ambulance Watanabe had called for arrived in the administration building. The three paramedics were not aware of the radiation situation, but at this point the senior management had localized the accident to the conversion test building, as when the accident occurred, the radiation alarms blared simultaneously in all buildings, so they were ordered to try to evacuate the workers as quickly as possible. The paramedics did as instructed, and managed to transfer Ouchi to a stretcher, and then carried him through to the JCO office building, and then out to the gate, where the ambulance was waiting. As they went back for Shinohara, Yokokawa waited and realised that nobody was going to ask him questions about the accident. Finally, he decided to grab a pen and write all the information they would need on a whiteboard. The conversion test building. The precipitation tank. Hisashi Ouchi, Masato Shinohara, Yutaka Yokokawa. 18.8% enrichment. 360 grams of uranium per litre. 16 kilograms of uranium, 2.3 kilograms mass limit. 40 minutes have passed since criticality, and only now did JCO send information to the Science and Technology Agency. But still, the lack of clarity continued up the chain of command. Only 2 workers were listed as being exposed to radiation, and instead of confirming the nature of the accident, which Yokokawa had told them, they only wrote possible criticality accident. The ambulance carrying the 3 workers had finally left the site and called the Tokaimura Fire Department to ask for a hospital to transfer the 3 workers to. The fire department first called the National Institute of Radiological Sciences, or NIRS. NIRS took the vitals from the 3 workers and decided to send them to the National Mito Hospital. Mito initially rejected them under the grounds that Ouchi and Shinohara were vomiting, indicating that their radiation dosage was much too high for them to treat, but NIRS begged them to at least perform first aid before they could be transported to them for medical treatment under leading experts. At 11:49, the ambulance finally left the site, en route to the Mito Hospital. They arrived at 12:07. At this point, the Science and Technology Agency had started their own work to contain the exposure from the accident, setting up roadblocks to halt people approaching the site. Almost 2 hours had passed since criticality, and finally the public was made aware of the nature of the accident. Loudspeakers throughout the region and radio broadcasts joined in unison to announce that a nuclear accident had occurred at JCO, with a possible release of radioactive materials. People were to shelter in place. Children could not leave their schools. However, they also claimed the accident may already be over, as the radiation levels were returning to normal. This was in fact because the solution had boiled and was now condensing before fissioning again. Even still, it would take another 10 minutes before the Prime Minister of Japan was made aware of the accident, and it would take almost 2.5 hours before the government would actively respond, as they required a commission to be established in Tokyo. The National Mito Hospital had been completely overwhelmed by the 3 patients. Scans of their bodies showed gamma rays emitting from their skin. The workers were struggling with diarrhea and vomiting. However, there was nothing they could do to help them. Instead, they decided to call the National Institute of Radiological Sciences and demanded that they take them for more urgent care. A helicopter was prepared, while the 3 workers were scrambled by ambulance to the local airport for the half-hour flight to the NIRS building, where workers struggled to prepare for emergency radiation treatment. White blood cell transplants, blood transfusions, everything. Official reports still failed to mention that the accident was a criticality accident. Still, nobody was considering sending devices to check the neutron counts around the village of Tokaimura, not even the Science and Technology Agency. The only group actively working to aid the local citizens was JCO itself. They went to the office of the mayor of Tokaimura village, requesting that they put in place an evacuation of people within 500 meters of the site, having already evacuated their own employees from a muster station for their safety. But the mayor refused, citing that the measured radiation dose was far below the 50 millisieverts per hour required for evacuation, instead ordering people to shelter in place. JCO were appalled, both at the abnormally high maximum dose limit and the refusal, and tried again half an hour later. This time, the mayor listened, and ordered the 47 houses within 350 meters of the site to be evacuated, which was carried out shortly thereafter. Workers from the Japanese Nuclear Cycle Development Institute, the company that JCO largely supplied fuel for, had arrived with equipment from their nuclear power plants to supply accurate measurements. This time they brought not just gamma radiation measuring equipment, but also alpha measuring equipment. When they turned the alpha measuring device on, they saw extremely high readings, and finally realized that there might be a neutron release. Yokokawa was right. It was a criticality accident. However, with no instruments to directly measure neutrons, they were at a loss, and had to ask for them to be supplied. In the meantime, everyone on site tasked with dealing with the accident had gathered in a meeting room. Yokokawa's message on the whiteboard had been found, and they managed to sketch out the precipitation tank to analyse it, determined that the water jacket was the cause of the criticality, and began brainstorming methods to remove the water jacket. When neutron measuring instruments arrived, they saw that the actual radiation levels were 10 times higher than they initially measured. The criticality accident was still in effect. The three workers arrived at the National Institute of Radiological Sciences, Ouchi and Yokokawa able to walk into the building, while Shinohara had to be escorted into the site on a bed. It was almost paradoxical. Despite Ouchi already being identified as the worst exposed patient, he equally seemed to be the healthiest from an outward perspective. There may have been a chance to save his life after all, if this was the case. As the Japan Atomic Energy Research Institute set up the local emergency headquarters for the accident, information from JCO was still not flowing in. A chaotic scene across Japan was unfolding. The news were broadcasting live about the accident. However, JCO lacked equipment to measure radiation. The Japanese government had headquartered in Tokyo and still hadn't prepared a full government-based response. The government-backed institutes were largely working independently, and nobody was requesting information together, researching independently. Finally, almost 10 hours after the accident, the government and nuclear research organisations based in Tokaimura were working in tandem, and began hosting meetings together to isolate the accident. Knowing that the criticality accident was in the precipitation tank, they now knew what options they had to terminate it. After calling Yokokawa at the National Institute for Radiological Sciences for final details, they came down to 3 options. The first was to inject boric acid into the precipitation tank. Boron is a good absorber of neutrons, and would certainly prevent another criticality from re-emerging afterwards, but they didn't know if it would be enough to stop it, and it would also be putting other workers at risk of high radiation doses entering the building. The second was to wheel a remote gun into the building and shoot the precipitation tank. It would for sure drain the water jacket, but it would also spray the contents of the precipitation tank into the rest of the conversion test building, making it too dangerous to approach. Nobody wanted this option. The third was to drain the water around the precipitation tank. They knew that the water was fed through a pipe outside the building, but not if they could use this fact to their advantage. They needed people to risk themselves to go to the wall immediately next to the precipitation tank and drain the water. Into the night, deliberations continued to plan what steps would be taken and to find volunteers to undertake the potentially dangerous procedure. A total of 21 men volunteered for the work. Given a maximum dose of 100 millisieverts, having to run over to the cooling tower at the back of the precipitation tank, itself in a narrow, unpaved area that would be difficult to access, they would have to run. They wanted to keep the workers at less than half that maximum dose, leaving them with just 3 minutes to perform operations at first. Each worker was donned in white protective uniforms with gas masks and given a standby car for the operations. At 2:35, the operation to end the criticality began. The first group left safety and hurried into the zone of danger, taking several photos of the region, including the circulation pump. This is what controlled the amount of water flowing through the water jacket. They hit their radiation limit as they were checking the sound of the pumps. 3 of the photos showed the valves for the pump were open. The second group entered the zone shortly thereafter. Performing a quick check of the acoustics of the pump, they confirmed it was running and returned. The third group then left. They found the valve that connected the pump and the cooling tower and closed it, preventing new water entering the system. They then opened the drain valve, hoping the water would flow out quickly. However, it failed to do so. This insufficient loss of water was ignored momentarily due to the sudden loss of neutron emissions. It was working. The fourth group exited once the third had returned. Given orders to break the pipe connecting the pump and water jacket, they attempted with the use of pulling and repeated blows. Failing, they went in search of a hammer. However, once they found one, they exceeded their limit and returned to the emergency headquarters. Handed the hammer, the fifth group made their way out and broke the pipe after repeated swings. The water from the water jacket began to splash out across the ground. This was in a small amount, though constituted a huge morale boost for everyone. The situation was almost over. As the group worked tirelessly to end the criticality, other members of the team were helping to reduce the amount of neutrons escaping the building. They piled sandbags high around the building, which helped to absorb the neutrons, providing shielding both for the reporters that had arrived at the scene and the local population as a whole. The sixth group's task was of grave importance. Their goal was to separate a union joint between the cooling tower and the water jacket. Using this, they could pump elements poisonous to fission reactions into the room, further speeding up the termination of criticality. Despite their best attempts, however, they were unsuccessful in removing the union joint. The seventh group were then given the task of finishing the sixth job. They hurried through, and in 3 minutes, they had successfully removed it, and returned to the group without exceeding their dosage limit. Once they returned, there was a small break before the eighth group left. They also carried extra supplies with them. This included a pipe. With a rush, they connected said pipe to where the union joint once was, with the intention of sending purging gas through it. Furthermore, they loosened several bolts that the cooling water flowed through and confirmed it was currently running. Water was being pumped out. The flange that the bolts were removed from was then disconnected. The ninth group left nearly 20 minutes later, in no rush now that the end was well within sight. Their job was a simple one. They connected a drain pipe to where the flange once was and allowed water to spray out in a larger volume than before. The 10th and final group left at 6 AM, 3 hours and 25 minutes after the operation started, and 19 hours and 25 minutes after criticality began, and moved to the pipe the 8th group had inserted. They pumped argon gas through the pipe, a poison to nuclear fission, and confirmed the water was drained. As argon entered, the neutron levels around the plant began to rapidly decrease. At 6:14 AM, the criticality occurring in the precipitation tank concluded. It had been fissioning for 19 hours, 39 minutes, and had released an enormous level of neutrons and dangerous radioactive isotopes. However, they dropped dramatically at this point. A fire truck was brought to the site, and the truck was filled with boric acid. Boron, as I mentioned earlier, is a very good absorber of neutrons, and made boric acid a suitable chemical for the procedure it was required for. Once the tank was full, the hose pipe was brought from the exterior of the building within by a group of people and eventually placed within the precipitation tank. The boric acid was pumped in, and this absorbed any remaining neutrons, preventing the criticality from starting up again. The members of the staff that entered the building as the pipe was inserted, and following this, were able to look around in the dark building, observing it, and finally able to meet the precipitation tank that was able to cause such a catastrophe. Little would happen for a while, as uncertainty loomed over the plant. However, at 7:45 AM, the Yoban Expressway was reopened, and the cars flowed through, the roadblocks left aside. By 9 AM, a first aid and care station was set up at the Mito Hospital, where the 3 workers who caused the accident had first been taken. There, checks for body contamination, medical examinations, and health advice was provided. By the end of the day, multiple care stations were set up across Ibaraki Prefecture. In total, 76,256 citizens were confirmed to have been exposed to radiation. It is unknown how many will go on to develop cancer or other radiation-related diseases as a result of this, although it is assumed it will be a very low number. The 21 members who partook in ending the criticality event received considerably high doses of radiation. However, no information regarding their fates have been published. At 9:20 a.m., the Nuclear Safety Commission and the Japanese government announced to the public in a joint statement that the accident was officially over. A day off school for students was allowed in Ibaraki, as each one had been closed to prevent contamination. At 4:30 p.m, the advice to shelter was lifted and people could roam in safety outdoors. That day, the city of Hitachinaka asked the National Institute for Radiological Sciences about the amount of radiation the people in the city had been exposed to during the criticality event. Examination of the region found it to be negligible, albeit minor concentrations of radioactive cesium were discovered in the seaweed and seashells on beaches, suggesting potential ocean water contamination had occurred in a minor amount. While the battle for Tokaimura had concluded in a victory, the battle for the survival for the 3 workers who accidentally started the accident had just begun.